Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a Boeing 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. In today's video we are going to look at the stall and the stall recovery maneuver in the Boeing 737. Be aware that this video is not designed for actual flight training, but is purely meant for entertainment purposes for use with several desktop flight simulators such as Microsoft Flight Simulator or X-Plane. So if you're an actual pilot, please refer to your company's documentation and your company's training. So, when we talk about stalls, we have to talk about two different conditions here. The first is the approach to stall, which is a maneuver that's usually carried out in pilot training, where you are in a controlled flight maneuver, approaching the stall and recovering on the first indication. An actual stall is an out of control but recoverable condition. The recovery maneuver is the same for both procedures. If we look into the past, most approach to stall incidents have occurred when there was sufficient altitude available for recovery, and those incidents that turned from an approach to stall into an actual accident usually occurred because the crew failed to make positive recovery when the stall warning occurred. And therefore the condition progressed into a full stall and the airplane impacted the ground in a stalled condition. And for exactly that reason, crew training has shifted from recovery with a minimum loss of altitude that we are probably mostly used to from the past, and that if you are a general aviation pilot, you will actually have to have trained and practiced with minimum loss of altitude for your practical pilot exam. And the training has shifted from the emphasis of losing minimal altitude to actually reducing the wing angle of attack below the stalling angle. Now, you have to be aware that the airplane can be stalled in any attitude, that's with the nose high, the nose low, and with a high or low angle of bank, and at any airspeed. That means you may be turning, you may have an accelerated stall, and it is not always intuitively obvious that the airplane is actually stalled. So an airplane stall is characterized by one or more of the following conditions. That's either the stall warning, which can be either artificial, such as a stick shaker, or natural, for example, buffet, which could be heavy at times, quote Boeing, or a lack of pitch authority, a lack of roll authority, or the inability to arrest your descent rate. Now, that may have sounded pretty technical, so let's make it easy. First of all, your airplane can be stalled more or less in any flight condition. So, for example, you might be flying a turn at 45 degrees angle of bank. Therefore, you have increased your G loading, and that increased your stall speed, so that at a speed where you would normally be well able to control the airplane, you might actually be stalling. And what I just said, increasing the G loading also increases your stall speed, is especially important if you look at it the other way around. Decreasing your G loading is going to decrease your stall speed. And that's something we're going to get to in a moment. Basically, the speed at which the airplane stalls is dependent on the airplane's weight. And by maneuvering, by increasing your G loading, you are actually increasing the airplane's weight. And therefore you are increasing the stall speed. Now if you do it the other way around, if you decrease your G loading below 1, that means that your stall speed is also going to be reduced. And I'm going to show you in a moment that you are perfectly able to fly the 737 at an airspeed of, for example, 80 knots, provided that your G loading is less than 1. And that becomes important when we talk about the stall recovery. So let's have a look into the stall recovery maneuver right now. I'm mostly going to go over the pilot flying task because that is what's important for most of you flight simmers. The pilot monitoring basically has the task to monitor altitude and airspeed, verify that all actions have been done, and he's going to call out any emissions, and he's going to call out any trend towards terrain contact. So that's the pilot monitoring's job. Now let's get to the pilot flying. The stall recovery maneuver is basically split into 3 phases. First of all, initiating the recovery. You'll have to hold the control column firmly. Now, in the real airplane, that's more important than in the simulator, since in the simulator you are not going to experience G-forces in front of your desktop computer. So, hold the control column firmly. Disengage autopilot and autothrottle. And then smoothly apply nose down elevator to reduce the angle of attack until buffet or stick shaker stops. Nose down stabilizer trim may be needed. So there may be conditions where the elevator is not strong enough that even when you are pushing fully forward on the control column, the nose is not going to come down. In that case, using nose down stabilizer trim may be needed. However, if you use excessive pitch trim, that can actually aggravate your condition and could result in a loss of control or high structural loads which may exceed the aircraft's limits. So be careful. Use just about as much nose down stabilizer trim until you actually feel the nose of the airplane coming down. And once that's coming down, that's all you need. Don't use more trim. That's the initiation of the recovery. Now we go on to the second step, continuing the recovery. Roll your wings level in the shortest direction. Advance thrust levers as needed, but be aware that since you have engines that are actually mounted under the wing, increasing engine thrust is going to cause a pitch up moment, which in return is going to make it more difficult to reduce your pitch angle. So especially if you had control problems previously, then increasing your thrust may make it harder to get your nose down. Retract the speed brakes, but do not change gear or flap configuration with a single exception, and that's during liftoff. In the takeoff, if your flaps are up, the pilot flying should call for the flaps 1 to provide some extra lift. So if you forgot to extend your flaps and you're getting a stall warning on liftoff, extend the flaps towards the 1 position. Apart from that, don't change configuration, so keep the gear and the flaps where they were. The third part of the stall recovery maneuver completes the recovery. That is, making sure that your airspeed has reached a sensible speed. So be aware that when you are still pulling the nose up, your stall speed is also going to be higher. Just like when you're still lowering the nose, so when your G loading is still below 1, your speed may still be at a point where it's not inside the amber band anymore on the speed indicator. However, once you actually level off and the G forces return to 1, it might result in a secondary stall. Establish the correct pitch attitude necessary and then return to the desired flight path and re-engage the autopilot and autothrottle if desired. So, looking at the stall, we have to differentiate between a high altitude recovery and a low altitude recovery. At higher altitudes, normally above 20,000 feet, the aircraft becomes increasingly thrust limited. So if you experience the first indication of a stall, nose down elevator and stabilizer trim will be needed to initiate a descent. And that's because when the airplane is thrust limited, you need to trade altitude for airspeed. And of course, in return, that means that if you're at a high altitude, then the stall recovery is going to use up a lot more altitude than it would at low altitudes. And that leads us to the low altitude recovery. Basically, when you're at low altitudes, ground contact becomes much more of a factor, while you also have much more thrust available. to correct your condition. So that means that in the low altitude recovery, it's especially important for the pilot monitoring to call out any trend towards ground contact. And if a stall warning is received shortly after takeoff, the pilot flying needs to smoothly adjust the pitch to reduce the angle of attack while avoiding ground contact, and may have to extend the flaps to the 1 position provided the flaps have been up inadvertently on the takeoff. Note that there is one more thing that we have to talk about here, and that is that certain system failures can cause erroneous stick shaker activations after liftoff, and if that stick shaker is activated continuously and the airspeed is at V2 or greater and the vertical speed is positive, so you are climbing, then continue the climb out to the acceleration height while monitoring altitude and airspeed. But be very careful for the signs of a stall that we talked about earlier on. So if you have lack of pitch authority, lack of roll authority, or an inability to arrest the descent rate, then you'll have to execute the stall recovery maneuver. Alright, that basically concludes the theory about the stall. So let's quickly recap our stall recovery procedure. Disengage autopilot and autothrottle, and then smoothly apply nose down elevator to reduce your angle of attack until the stick shaker or the buffeting stops. Stabilizer trim may be needed. Continue the recovery by rolling the wings level in the shortest direction possible. Advance the thrust levers as you need it, but be aware that applying thrust aggressively is going to cause a pitch up moment. Retract the speed brakes and do not extend the gear or flaps configuration, except for extending flaps to 1 in case they have been up during their liftoff. Complete the recovery while making sure that airspeed and thrust are as needed. Establish a correct pitch attitude and then return to the desired flight path and re-engage the autopilot and autothrottle. Now that sounds complex, but I'm going to show you that it's not quite as complex as it sounds. Aviation has this wonderful tendency that you can make everything sound like rocket science, while a lot is actually intuitive as well. So let's have a look at what that's going to look like. We're going to disregard this master caution here. As I already said a couple of times, the simulator is not a great fan of being paused for a long time. And while we're at it, let's also quickly turn away from the terrain. One more thing, you can see I've just turned the flight directors off, and that is not part of the approach to stall recovery maneuver. However, the flight directors are not going to give you good indications. They are not made for a stall recovery. So, I've reduced the thrust to idle. Note that I'm not trimming at the moment. I want my airplane to stay trimmed out at a proper airspeed. You can see how we are slowly pitching up as the speed reduces. And once we enter the amber band, we are actually going to get the first signs of our actual stall. And as soon as that happens, we're going to apply the recovery maneuver.
Airspeed full. Airspeed full.
And when you recover, be very careful not to cause a secondary stall. Alright, now let's do it a second time. This time we'll wait for the stick shaker to activate. I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit so that you can see a bit better.
Airspeed full. Airspeed full.
And here we have the stick shaker. And here we are recovered. Okay, I'm going to show you one more condition. This time we'll wait until the actual stall happens before we start the recovery. This is purely for demonstration purposes in the flight simulator, and in real life, if you have an approach to stall, on the very first indication of it, you are going to start the recovery maneuver no matter what. But for flight simming purposes, just to show you,
Airspeed full. Airspeed full.
and this is the actual stall. And especially now, we have to be careful not to cause a secondary stall.
Caution to range.
You can see how the amber band on the speed indicator is really coming up when we're pitching up, because we have positive G's there. And that's what I told you earlier on, that when we are pulling the nose up, we are increasing G forces. Therefore, we are increasing the, I'll call it, artificial weight of the airplane here. And that is going to increase your stall speed. So that's why we have to be very careful when we are getting ourselves out of the stall, that we don't cause a secondary stall. Now, I told you earlier on that it's actually very easy to cause a high-speed stall, and I'll give you a demonstration for this. Let's go to 40 degrees angle of bank, and now watch the airspeed tape and watch the indication in there increase.
Bank angle.
You see how quickly it's coming up? We're maintaining 7,000 feet at 200 knots, and we are very short of actually entering the amber band on the speed indicator. Now if I go to 60 degrees angle of bank, here we are in the stall. Easy as that. Alright. I told you one more thing earlier on, and that is that we can very easily fly the 737 at an airspeed of 80 knots without stalling. And that's going to be the opposite of the demonstration I just gave you. That is when we are reducing our G loads. So, let's actually go ahead and do that. I'm going to increase our speed a little bit here to bring us into a good condition from where to start this maneuver. So, let's pitch up a little bit. And now reducing the G loading and pushing the nose down. See how easy the airplane flies at this speed? Fully controllable, it's not stalled at the moment. Of course now, when we gotta recover, we'll have to be very careful not to get the secondary stall, because you can see right now, when I'm actually pulling very hard, I'm getting into the amber band, despite I'm flying 250 knots. And that's the effect of the G-forces. And completing the recovery, we'll set a decent pitch, we'll set a decent thrust, And here we are again. Alright, this concludes the theoretical and practical demonstration of the stall recovery maneuver. And I'll just take this opportunity to point you to a second video that I am about to upload. By the time you're watching this, it's probably going to be online already, in which I'm going to show you the 3 approach to stall maneuvers that Boeing has designed for pilots and for pilot training to familiarize pilots with the recovery procedure in the conditions where they are most likely going to cause trouble and where history has caused it to cause trouble in actual flights. Until then, if you liked this video, please consider a donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description, or consider becoming a Patreon. And until then, I'm looking forward to see you all again on the next video, and hope that you all are going to have a great day. Thank you very much for watching.